Page 161. 3 pillars on which the archipelago is propped were set there by the leadership: the differentiated ration pot, the work brigade, and the 2 sets of bosses. And the 4th and main pillar was Tukta, and it was put there by the archipelago natives and by life itself. For Tukta, it is essential to have an energetic, enterprising brigadiers, but production chiefs from among the Zaks are even more necessary. No few of them were foremen, norm setters, planners, economists, because you just wouldn't drag free people off to those distant places. Some Zaks in those positions forgot who they were, became more cruel than free workers, trampled on their brother prisoners, and made their way over dead bodies to their own release ahead of term. Others, on the contrary, retained a distinct consciousness of their motherland, the archipelago, and introduced reasonable moderation in the management of production and a reasonable share of Tukta in their accounting. There was a risk for them in this, not the risk of getting a new term, but the terms were already piled high anyways, and their code articles were harsh, but the risk of losing their position, angering the chiefs, landing in a bad prisoner transport, and thus perishing silently. And therefore their staunchness and intelligence were more glorious in that they helped their brothers to survive. Vasily Grigorievich Vlasov, for example, whose acquaintance we have already made in connection with the Katy trial, was that kind of person. Throughout his whole long sentence, he served 19 years without any interruption. He retained that same stubborn self-assurance which characterized his conduct during the trial, and which he had mocked Kalinin and the commutation of his death sentence. Through all these years, when he was dried up from starvation and breaking his back on general work, he perceived himself not as a scapegoat, but as a genuine political prisoner, and even as a revolutionary, as he used to describe himself in heart-to-heart conversations. And when, thanks to his naturally sharp administrative grasp, which in this case substituted for his incomplete schooling in economics, he held jobs as a trustee at production posts, Vlasov sought not only to postpone his own death, but also the chance to patch up the whole cart so it was easier for the rest of the fellows to pull it along. In the 40s, on one of the Ustvin logging campsites, and GULag was distinct from the general pattern in that it had only one unified set of bosses. The camp itself ran its logging, did its own auditing, and was responsible for plan fulfillment to the Ministry of Timber Industry. Vlasov simultaneously combined the duties of norm setter and planner. He was ahead of the whole thing there, and in winter, in order to provide support for the sloggers out logging, he credited their brigades with fictitious cubic yards of wood cut. One of the winters was particularly severe, and working just as hard as they could, the Zaks fulfilled the work norms by only 60%, but received rations for having fulfilled 125% of the norm. And with the help of these beat-up rations, they managed to last out the winter without halting work even one day. However, shipments of the felled on paper timber were far behind schedule, and the camp chief heard some evil rumors. In March, he sent a commission of foremen into the woods, and they turned up a shortage of 10,500 cubic yards in timber. The enraged chief summoned Vlasov, who heard him out and then said to him, "Give him, chief, 5 days in the brig. They're all sluts." They were too lazy to get out in the woods because the snow there is still deep. Set up a new commission with me as the chairman. And thereupon, with his own sensible troika, Vlasov, without leaving his office, drew up an official document and found all the missing timber. The chief was quieted down for the time being, but in May there was more trouble. They were still shipping out too little timber, and the higher-ups kept asking questions. So the chief called in Vlasov again. Vlasov was a short fellow, but he always retained his vigorous rooster-like bearing, and this time he didn't even pretend. The timber just didn't exist. So how could you have drawn up a false document? Blankety blank blank blank, Vlasov replied. Do you think it would have been better for you to go to jail yourself? After all, 10,500 cubic yards is a full 10-ruble bill for a free employee, and even for a check it's a $5. The chief cursed him out, but by this time it's too late to punish Vlasov. The whole thing depended on him. Well, what's to be done now anyway? What's to be done now? Vlasov answered. Just wait till the roads have completely dissolved in mud. And the time came when the winter roads had all dissolved completely, and the summer logging trails were still impassable too. And at this point, Vlasov brought the chief a detailed and watertight report for his signature to be sent on to the administration higher up. In it, he proved that because of the highly successful timber felling operations of the past winter, it had been quite impossible to move 10,500 cubic yards out of the forests on the sledge trails. Neither could this timber be hauled out through the swampy forests. Next, he gave estimates for the cost of a corduroy road to get the timber out, and he proved that the haulage would cost more than the timber was worth, so that in a year's time, because the logs were going to be lying there in the swamp for a whole summer and autumn, they would be unsuitable for lumber and acceptable to any possible customer only for firewood, and the administration agreed with these literate conclusions, which they were not ashamed to show any other commission, and therefore the whole 10,500 cubic yards of timber were written off. And so it was that the trees were felled and eaten up and written off, and stood once again erect and proud in their green coniferous garb. And in fact, the state paid very reasonably for these dead cubic yards, a few hundred extra loaves of black, gluey, watery bread. The thousands of trees and the hundreds of lives which were saved were of no account on the profit and loss sheet, because this kind of wealth was never counted in the archipelago. In all probability, Vlasov was not the only one who had been as perspicacious as to play the swindler, because from 1947 on, they introduced a new system in all logging operations, completely complex work gangs and complex work brigades. And now the lumberjacks were combined with the Teamsters in one work gang, and the brigade was only credited with timber hauled out to the slide on the riverbank to the site of the spring log drive. And so, what happened then? Did this burst the balloon of the Tukta? Hardly. It even flourished. It expanded out of necessity, and the mass of workers nourished on it grew larger and larger. For those among our readers who are not bored with this, let's go into it more deeply. 1. The sects were not permitted to accompany the logs farther than the slide on the riverbank. Who would convoy them down the river? Vigilance. Therefore, an expediter of the log rafting office, which was staffed with free lumberjacks, accepted the lumber from the camp dispatcher for all the brigades at the river, while now he, of course, was strict in his receipts. Not at all. The camp dispatcher would infiltrate the figures as much as he had to on behalf of the logging brigades, and the expediter of the log rafting office was agreeable to the whole deal. 2. And here's why. The log rafting office also had the problem of feeding its own free workers, and their work norms were equally impossible, and the log rafting office listed all of this non-existent fictitious timber as having been rafted downriver. 3. At the general landing and sorting point downriver, where the timber was collected from all the logging sectors, there was a bourse, which is a landing area for logs. Here again, sects were doing the work. Attached to that self-same Ust-Finlag, from 52 islands of Ust-Finlag, were scattered over a territory 96 square miles. Now that is what our archipelago is like. The dispatcher of the log rafting office was quite at ease. The camp expediter would now accept back all the Tukta in the second place, so as not to betray his own camp, which had previously delivered it to the slide, and in the first place, so as to feed its own prisoners working at the landing point with that same fictitious timber. They too had their own fantastic work norms, and they needed their crust too. At this point, however, the camp expediter had to toil a bit for the sake of society. He not only had to accept the timber by total volume, but also list it, existing and fictitious by diameters and lengths, in a complete schedule. Now here was a benefactor for you. Vlasov worked at this job too. 4. After the bourse came the sawmill, which processed the logs into cut lumber. Once more, the workers were sects. The brigades were given rations on the basis of their volume of raw timber processed, and the extra fictitious timber was just exactly what they needed in order to increase their own percentage output. 5. Next came the lumberyard for the completed product, which was required, according to state norms, to have 65% of the amount of raw timber received by the sawmill. Thus it was that 65% of the fictitious timber moved invisibly into the lumberyard, and the mythical lumber was likewise inventoried by sorts: wavy edge slab, construction lumber, by thickness of board, edged and unedged. The lumberyard workers too got their food out of that same fictitious timber. But what happened then? The fictitious lumber was shut up in the lumberyard, where it was guarded by the camp guard, and there could be no more uncontrolled losses. And who at this point was going to answer for the Tukta, and how? At this point, another great principle of the archipelago came to the aid of the principle of Tukta. This was the principle of rubber. In other words, stretching things out with interminable delay. Once on the books, the fictitious production kept being carried over from one year to another. Whenever there was inventory taking in this wild archipelago backwoods, all those engaged in it were, after all, friends, and all understood. You wouldn't go around moving every board in the place just for the sake of the audit. Unfortunately, a certain percentage of fictitious lumber could spoil from being kept too long and could be written off. And they would fire one manager on the lumberyard and then another and put them to work as work norm setters. And how many people had been fed in the meantime? Here is what they tried to do too when they loaded lumber into railroad cars for shipments to buyers. There was no customer expediter up there, and the railroad cars would subsequently be scattered all over the country on the basis of bills of lading. They tried similarly to ship the fictitious lumber as well. In other words, to inflate the amount shipped, and this fed the stevedores' brigades. Let's note, the railroad put a seal on the car. I couldn't care less. It couldn't care less. After a certain length of time, somewhere in Averbakh or Ch5, they would break the seal on the car and open it up and document the amount actually received. If the underweight was moderate, then all these differences in the volume would be collected in some schedule or another, and it would be up to the State Planning Commission to account for them. If the underweight was outrageous, the recipient would send a claim to GULag, but these claims moved in a flood of millions of other papers and were stapled in a file somewhere, and in time simply went out like a light. After all, they simply could not stand up against people's pressure to live, and no one was going to send the carload of lumber back from Averbakh. You took what you got. There was no timber in the South. Now let us note the fact that the state and the Ministry of the Timber Industry made serious use of their economic reports of these fictitiously inflated figures for the production of cut and processed timber. They were useful to the ministry too, but probably the most surprising thing was, it would seem, that there should have been a shortage of timber because of the fictitious inflation of quantities at every stage of its movement. However, the fact was that the expediter at the landing ports managed to add so much fictitious timber to deliveries in the course of the summer season that by fall the timber rafting office had surpluses waiting in the water. They had not been touched, and they must not be left in the river for winter, because if they were, it would be necessary in the spring to call in a plane to bomb them loose. And therefore this surplus timber, which no one needed, was allowed in late autumn to float downstream into the White Sea. Is that miraculous, strange and wonderful? But it didn't just happen in one place. At the lumber yards in GULag, there was always surplus lumber left over, which hadn't been loaded into railroad cars, and which was no longer listed as belonging to anyone, anywhere. And for years after some lumberyard had been totally shut down, people would subsequently journey to it from nearby camps for ownerless dry firewood and burn it in their stoves. The stripped pit props, which had taken so much suffering to produce, and burn it in them. All this was a matter of attempting to survive, not to enrich oneself, and certainly not to plunder the state. The state cannot be so excessively fierce and force its subjects into deceit. And here's what the prisoners used to say: without Tukta and Amono, never could we have built the canal. So all that is what the archipelago stands on. Thank you for listening. It should be good next time. Have a good day.